I thank you very much for this opportunity. Let me put on for slideshow, which will be easier for you to see. So again, my gratitude to the Madinah Institute for Leadership and Entrepreneurship for giving me this opportunity to talk to you, my esteemed audience, on this very important subject of growing your company globally and profitably. I'm not going to take the time, the valuable time of this webinar to go into the details of my background. I appreciate the wonderful introduction to me. But the key thing for you to remember, the perspective that I'm coming from, is first, as a business executive, roughly 40 years, 4 decades of roaming the world on behalf of multiple companies, doing international business. And then midway in that career, getting my PhD in international business so that I could be armed with some of the more analytical frameworks to help make better business decisions. And it's the combination of those two things. So I hope that you're an audience that appreciates a little bit of humor. You'll see that I also list for myself here, International Profit Detective. That's a title that was given to me informally by IBM when they had me go around the world and talk to venture capitalists about establishing international business alliances. And, you know, all my other titles that I had in business may have sounded very sophisticated, but they didn't really get to the main point of what I tried to do throughout my career, which was to use analytical, systematic techniques for helping senior executives of companies make better international business decisions. So that's why they coined this term for me, International Profit Detective. The other perspective that I want to start with, and it's really important that I do this, I don't want to come to you as somebody from the West, somebody from the United States that knows it all and is somehow trying to teach you as though you don't know anything about international business. I know that's not true, which is why I have this slide that says Muslim trade routes. The spread of Islam created a vast trading empire that stretched from West Africa to Southeast Asia. I'm sure you know your history, but sometimes it's good to be reminded of it. Take a look at this chart. Take a look at the extent. This is from medieval times. This is before Europe was engaged in significant international trade, before the Industrial Revolution, before the dominance of the West. So I know that I'm talking to an audience from a history and a culture much older than mine in terms of being involved in international business. The other perspective that I have is my contribution to making better international business decisions is based partly on my original academic training, which was in physics and mathematics. So I'm attempting to use the discipline of science to help international business people make better decisions. But even on that subject, I want to express a certain humbleness of dealing with an audience primarily from the Islamic culture and history, that long before we came to the forefront, had our Renaissance, began to develop the scientific method, Islam was contributing to science and mathematics and philosophy. In fact, it is even a core. This comes from an Islamic site. I would not presume to quote from the Quran, the Noble Quran, myself, but this comes from an Islamic site. So I'm sharing it with you. The quote from the Quran, which basically is saying that it is part of your duty in order to understand the revelations of the Quran is to understand the world, and that means its mathematics, its sciences, its philosophies. So I know I'm talking to an experienced and sophisticated culture. I just wanted to share that with you. I don't want you to feel that I'm talking down to you. Actually, I'm talking up to you. The other overview quick thing, and some of these slides I'm going to go through quickly in the interest of time, and I can't teach you everything about growing your business globally and profitably in 40 minutes, but I want to get through a few key points. One key point is just how much of that activity is taking place. In 2015, there were 11,930 foreign direct investment projects in the world, representing a total capital investment of $713 billion. The Middle East is growing in importance as part of that foreign direct investment activity. There's been a growing flow into the Middle East of foreign direct investment. And this chart illustrates some of the places that it's been going and the sectors and the countries that, particularly Egypt, that has become such a major point of foreign direct investment in recent years. But actually, more to the point of this seminar and what we're trying to impart to you is the next slide, which is the growth, the tremendous recent growth in foreign direct investment out of the Middle East. The countries of the Middle East are now becoming really active global participants, and they're doing that by making investments and acquiring and joint venturing with companies throughout the world. And so there was a lot of that activity in 2015 and 2016. To do all of that, you need to make good decisions. What do I mean by international business decision analysis? Well, basically, and this is something, actually one of the fancy titles that I had, I was the manager of the International Business Decision Analysis Unit at Chase Manhattan Bank in the early years of its rapid international expansion. And in my way of thinking, what I meant by international business decision analysis was fact-based, systematic, and comparative. So this webinar identifies some of the real-world decision analysis techniques that I've used over the years and used with executives that I was consulting to or helping in identifying country opportunities for specific industries, for assessing and mitigating the associated country risks, and for incorporating both of those things, the opportunity analysis and the risk analysis, into a specific systematic global expansion strategy. So again, I cannot presume in 40 minutes to teach you every single aspect of what it took me 40 years to learn how to do well. But let's go. Let's go through at least some elements of it to give you a flavor as to what we mean by fact-based, systematic, and comparative analysis to support international business decisions. It's no surprise that when you're doing business outside of your home country, you have to rethink all of the different functions. Your marketing function, your production function, your personnel functions, your financial functions within your company, all change once they're also being done in another country. And similarly, you're used to in your home country, the environment, the political, economic, social, financial, technological, labor, etc., regulatory environment of your home country. And when you go to other countries to do business, all of those things are different. So one of the reasons that you have to take a systematic, fact-based, comparative approach is to be able to sort this all out. It's very complicated. Even if you're going to one other country, it's complicated, let alone making portfolio decisions about multiple countries as you begin to expand globally. Usually companies choose one of two ways to be organized to begin their global expansion. One way is to set up an international division, to say we understand that international is different enough. We really have to have a whole separate department devoted to that. And that's what we did at Chase initially. We had an international department at Chase Manhattan Bank. That's where I worked. But another choice is to simply take each of your product lines, each of your major business units, and let them expand globally by worldwide product division. Now, I've seen successful examples of both, but where it usually leads over time is to a global matrix management. You basically, to do good growth globally and profitably, ultimately you're going to go to a global matrix model that is going to require the worldwide product divisions to coordinate with the geographic or area divisions of a company. How do you plan for all of this? Well, if any of you come from a systems background, you know, we're presenting this to you in kind of a flowchart format. You have to analyze both your domestic, your international, and foreign environments. You have to analyze your corporate controllable variables, and you have to analyze the present corporate business vision and mission statements. And after you've considered all of these things, that external environment analysis, the corporate controllable variables, and what your overall business vision is, then you need to sell those corporate objectives in the context of all three of those things. You need to qualify the goals based upon the constraints or limitations of the external environment, the corporate controllable variables, and so forth. Alter as appropriate, feedback, get it to where you can actually formulate specific strategies for your global expansion, and then make tactical plans for it. So on each step of this flowchart, there are different kinds of facts that have to be gathered. There are different systematic ways of organizing those facts. And it all has to be done, I remind you, in a comparative way, since you're dealing with multiple potential countries to enter. Even deciding how you enter another country requires a fairly complex business decision process. Are you going to simply export to that other country? Are you going to establish turnkey contracts with entities in that other country? Are you going to license some of your intellectual property or technology to that other country? Are you going to engage in franchising? Are you going to do joint ventures with companies from other countries? Or are you going to actually do regular full foreign direct investment to establish your own wholly owned subsidiaries? Now, there are advantages and disadvantages to each of these. And that's what you have to, again, gather the facts systematically and comparatively in order to make the choice of entry mode. What are some of the factors that you need to consider? Well, the transport costs, the trade barriers, the political risks, the economic risks, the costs, your own firm's strategy. There's no one optimal mode. Depends on your situation of your firm. What makes sense for your company might not make sense for another company. But the key now, the one thing that I'm choosing to dwell on and to lecture and to expand upon in this presentation to you are these softer elements that especially companies that are first going international, boy, was this true for most American companies. You know, we're a young country, but we're even younger in terms of most of our companies being involved in international business. And so these political risk aspects and economic risk aspects and even the trade barrier aspects, these were brand new things that our companies weren't used to considering. So we developed, I first did this at Chase Manhattan Bank in the early years of our global expansion in support of the executive vice president and his staff for the international department at Chase. a method of market screening. I mean, there are over 200 countries in the world. You can't be in or do business with all of them. So you have to begin to gather facts systematically and comparatively, as illustrated in this chart. Are the basic needs for what you do? Is there a value proposition that makes sense for what you do, the products or services that you offer in a country? What about the overall economic and financial situation of that country? What about the political and legal environment of that country? What about the socio-cultural environment of that country? And frankly, what is the competitive situation? Both local companies that you might be competing against or other multinational companies operating in that country. Ultimately, this leads to a final selection. A real-world consulting project that I did, I left Chase many years ago, but from time to time they've called me back. Each time they seem to get acquired by another bank. The acquiring bank wanted to get them back into international. They'd kind of withdrawn from some of their international presences. And so they would call me to help them think through that process. And I remember one specific assignment in particular was they saw that things were beginning to happen in quote unquote the emerging market countries. Now that's a term that you are all familiar with today. It's amply talked about in the business press. Actually, at the time, there were only about a half dozen people in the world, one guy at the World Bank, another guy in an investment bank in Boston, myself at Chase, that even coined that term and used that term. We saw something new happening in what used to be called the lesser developed countries, that some of those lesser developed countries that people kind of just lumped aside when they thought globally, they said they're poor, they're not going anywhere, they're not of any great interest to international business. There were a few of us that saw that things were beginning to change, and that in fact some of the lesser developed countries were going to in fact become major players in the world of global business. So we tried to sort that all out. We used a logical process like this to do some market screening to determine the most likely candidates for Chase either to expand its existing business in or to go into if they weren't already there. Now, how did we look at these complex issues of risk and opportunity? You know, Chase had a whole economics department, PhD economists from great schools that would write economic reports and forecasts on countries. And they had international advisors. Actually, our international advisory board was headed by Henry Kissinger, the former Secretary of State of the United States. And he would present his overview of some world political trends, and then talk about some particular countries. But the problem was that both the detailed economic forecasts from our economics department and the general guidance being given to us by our International Advisory Committee was not organized on a fact-based, systematic, and comparative basis. So that was the problem. To be able to look at the political, economic, legal, and cultural aspects of a country as they impacted both risk and opportunity. This particular slide I used when I was working with IBM to help them have their clients expand globally, and we added an additional dimension called e-business readiness. But the point here in the mind, what I'm trying to do in this 40 minutes is to just set the tone mentally with you as to how to structure the organization of facts in a way that supports making good international business decisions. And ultimately, you want to be able to present that. As a result of doing that analysis, you ideally want to be able to present to senior management when they are undergoing their global planning process. And that's why comparative is so important. You want to be able to compare the risk versus the opportunity of individual countries. So the bubbles on this chart represent individual countries. Since, again, the chart that I'm sharing with you by way of example is one that I used with IBM, the color scheme in the bubbles is how ready the country is for e-business. So if you are low risk, but high opportunity, the bottom quadrant, right? Low risk, risk is the vertical axis, you're down at the bottom, and you're way over to the right, a high opportunity. Those are the most logical countries. And the ones you're probably going to rule out in the screening are the ones that are in the upper left, right? They have a high risk, but very little opportunity. The other two quadrants are the hard ones, because that's where you have to really earn your bucks as an executive. You have to make trade-offs between the amount of risk that you're willing to take versus the amount of opportunity that you're going after. So this is just a visual. You know, you don't see particular countries here. You don't see numbers. You will. I have some examples later that will show you this. But I just want to set your mental framework. This is where we're going with the collecting of the facts systematically and comparatively. Now, what do we mean by country risk? Interestingly enough, because I had that assignment at Chase, and then when I left Chase to go to Business International Corporation to build and create and run their global consulting business, one of the first issues we faced was how to take the information that we had about countries and help companies evaluate the amount of country risks that they were being exposed to. Risks that are above and beyond the normal commercial business risks that you take anywhere you do business, including your home country. So I had to establish a definition. So my definition for country risk that I want to share with you is threats to the assets or expected earnings from those assets of a foreign corporation operating in a country from the political, economic, financial, social, cultural, or legal or regulatory environment. Now think about that definition. What are the assets? Well, when you if you buy a company in another country, or you de novo, you build a factory in another country, what you have as a result of that investment is an asset. Now, usually in your normal decision-making process of capital budgeting, you have some kind of expected earnings that you're expecting to make from having that asset in that country. Country risk are the things that happen in the political, economic, financial, social, cultural, or legal or regulatory environment that could negatively impact actually your assets themselves or the expected earnings from those. Okay, we're happy you came in and invested in our country and you have this asset that you 100% own, but we're going to give you a period of time and you have to divest 51% of that to either to our government or to our local people. We want a controlling interest. So we're not totally expropriating you. We're willing to buy that portion of your business. But the point is, the end result is you're not going to control your own asset anymore. We are. Well, 17% of the companies experienced that in the developed countries. 2/3 of the companies, 67%, experienced it in Latin America, 25% in Africa, Middle East, and 41% in Asia Pacific. So that's much more frequent and more common than expropriation. But then you can drill down, and country risk can even be more subtle. Remember I said it's not just a threat to your assets, but it's a threat to your expected earnings from your assets. Operational restrictions. Oh, we're not going to take away your asset, but we're going to tell you, we're going to have rules that tell you how you operate your business. And that can many times negatively impact your expected earnings when you thought you had total control. 30% experienced that in the developed countries, 54% in Latin America, 27% in Africa, Middle East, and 25% in Asia Pacific. I have one more chart like this. I realize I need to get through this a little more rapidly so that we can get into the other things, but I think you're getting the gist of these facts that we gathered. This was part of the fact collection part so that we could develop some decision tools to incorporate risk versus opportunity analysis. So what were some of the other risks? Discrimination. An example of discrimination is we don't want you to put all of our local companies out of business. So we're going to allow you to be in our country, but we're going to charge you twice as much for electricity than we charge our local companies. We're going to discriminate against you to make it harder for you to compete against our local companies. 15% of the companies surveyed, and again, this is approximately 200 companies, had experienced that in the developed countries, 18% in Latin America, 11% in Africa, Middle East, and 17% in Asia Pacific. Let's keep drilling down on these things that can negatively impact your expected earnings from your assets in other countries. Price controls. Fine, you can have your asset, you can do business, but we're going to tell you what prices you can charge for your products. Believe it or not, 60% of the companies experience that even in developed countries. 75% in Latin America, 28% in Africa, Middle East, and 33% in Asia Pacific. Now, when I've showed this chart to American companies or even to European companies, they're shocked because when they think country risk, they think Africa, Middle East, Latin America, Asia. And I'm saying one of these very significant country risks, price controls, actually occurs even more frequently in the developed countries. The next one, blockage of remittances. This one greatly impacted my life for a year. Blockage of remittances is when the host government, the country that you're operating in, says, you can do business, we're not going to interfere with you, you can make profits, but you can't convert those profits to dollars and take them out of our country. If you're going to make money in our country, the money has to stay in our country. And as you see, 17% of the companies experience that in the developed countries, 60% in Latin America, 35% in Africa, Middle East, and 18% in Asia Pacific. I got a knock on my door. This was now my second stint with Chase. I was with Chase 2 separate times. My last time, my title was Senior International Planning Officer of the International Department. And it was the head of international, my boss, the EVP, and he said, Newman, Henry Kissinger says that Egypt is going to go the same way as Iran. And we have a joint venture bank with the National Bank of Egypt there that's been extremely profitable. And we're sitting on the equivalent of $100 million worth of Egyptian pounds in Egypt that we can't get out of the country. Find a solution for us. And so I spent about a year. The solution basically was to find a buyer, somebody external to Egypt that would pay us money for our share of that joint venture, which would be a way of getting our money out. And it was a very interesting experience. By the way, Henry Kissinger was wrong at the time. I had done very formal, the way that I gather facts, systematize them, and compare them. My views of Egypt were not nearly so negative as Henry Kissinger's at that point in time. But, you know, Henry was a more famous person than me, and we did eventually get out. We did sell our portion of that joint venture. I think it was a bad decision. I think, personally, we should have stayed in Egypt. Neither here nor there. The last one that I'm sharing with you is breach in government contracts. Now, this is where the country says, come on in, invest in us, do business. We're not going to interfere with you. We're going to have a contract that establishes our relationship. And then many years later, after you're firmly established, have made tremendous investments of both money and technology and people, the government of the host country says, well, we want to change the contract now. We don't need you as much as we needed you before, so we're going to revise the terms of the contract. It doesn't happen a lot, but it does happen. The history is it has happened a lot in the Middle East, and that's because of the changing relationship, and I'm not going into the rights or wrongs of this. This is fact-based analysis here. This isn't about favoring one country against another country or anything like that. When you're doing international business analysis, you have to put all of that aside. But in truth, the original contracts for a lot of the foreign oil companies that came to the Middle East were very favorable to them and not so favorable to the host country. And after a while, the host country said, you know what, we've got to change those terms. After all, it is our oil. Anyway, 17% of the companies had experienced that in the Africa Middle East region. So that gives you a flavor. It's not every single type of country risk, but all I'm attempting to do in this webinar is, again, set your mind mentally, structurally, how to look at some of these things. While I was at Business International, we developed something called a country assessment service that gathered facts systematically and comparatively on behalf of the 300 major multinational corporations that were our clients. I created that. It was called the Country Assessment Service. Years later, the Economist Intelligence Unit out of England acquired Business International and folded everything that Business International did into their great organization. And to this day, they continue to use the basis of what we had in our country assessment service. I mean, they've improved it, they've changed it. I admire them that they have kept it, and I admire them that they've made it even better. And so to this day, you can get country risk ratings from the Economist Intelligence Unit, and I'm showing them here for Brazil as an example. And they do it on a basis of 0 to 100. So they're actually giving a metric evaluating the degree of country risk. 0 would mean there was no risk. 100 would mean it's the riskiest conceivable country in the world. So in this case, Brazil comes out with a 49 as an overall assessment, which is a fairly high degree of country risk if you start looking comparatively at other countries. But then they break that down, thinking about those factors of the 200 multinational corporations that I surveyed. They break down the country risk into security risk, political stability risk, government effectiveness risk, legal and regulatory risk, macroeconomic risk, foreign traded payments risk, financial risk, tax policy risk, labor market risk, and infrastructure risk. Now, it's not just the letter grades and the numbers. The numbers are very useful, which you'll see later, because it allows us to create that chart that shows the trade-off between the degree of country risk and the degree of country opportunity. So we did that at Business International, and the Economist Intelligence Unit has chosen to keep that, and I'm grateful that they did, because that's what allows for the comparative. Now, when you read their reports, there are pages and pages of material that discuss how did these numbers come about, what was happening in the country with regard to political stability, what was happening with regard to security risk, what about the legal and regulatory environment of the country. So it's not just scores, it's not just numbers, it's a lot of factual information and trends that they present to their clients. You have to subscribe to this. It's a reasonably expensive thing to subscribe to, because after all, what you're gaining access to is a worldwide business intelligence network that does this for over 70 countries. But ultimately, it gets down to this comparative score. In addition to that, and something that I use many times in companies that I'm working with individually, is what the Economist Intelligence Unit now calls the Brazil Risk Watch Index. They establish a set of scenarios of really bad things that could be happening over the next few years. So it's a relatively short time short-term risk analysis. But they want companies to be able to know that they have to monitor these things very closely. Some of them are financial, some of them are security, government effectiveness, the legal and regulatory environment, the foreign trade and payments environment. And what they do is they assess. Now this again is their analysts, their assessment. Small and medium-sized enterprises face more restricted access to credit. That's a financial variable in country risk analysis. They rate that probability of happening very high, and the impact, if it does happen, would it really negatively impact your business in that country as being, very high. Sorry, I'm skipping ahead here. I didn't mean to do that. And the multiple of those two things gives a score for intensity. And they color scheme that. Red means it's very likely to happen, and it'll have a horrible impact on you if it does happen. And so that's the one you really need to focus on. They then look at the others and do the same thing and rate the probability. So the security risk one, organized crime endangers goods transport along major highways, is only moderately likely to happen, but if it does happen, that could highly impact your business, and so forth and so on. Again, this is a lot for you to be digesting in a short period of time, but it's setting the mental framework of how we go about doing international business decision analysis in a fact-based, systematic, and comparative way. Let me move quickly to show you some of the results. Those scores allow you to take the opportunity. In this case, it was a consumer company, consumer goods company. So we took the personal disposable income growth rate of countries. We took the risk rating, and the size of the bubble is the size of the personal disposable income in that country. And so basically this allows senior management to see in one chart the result of all of that detailed analysis in one chart: opportunity vertically, risk horizontally, size of the market, size of the bubble, and begin to do some decision making with regard to these countries. One of the areas of my specialty right now, I mentioned that I was one of the original users of the term emerging markets, but even more recently, through my friend who used to be the chief economist at Goldman Sachs, he coined the term BRIC for Brazil, Russia, India, and China. And a lot of my both academic work now, I presented at Oxford University on this subject, but also in working with companies, is to focus their attention on Brazil, Russia, India, and China. And so we start that by also showing risk versus opportunity. I want to just very quickly introduce you to the concept of the cultural aspect and the importance of that. By culture, so now we're talking things beyond just the political, economic, financial environment. We're talking about the social, cultural environment as it would impact both risk and opportunity. Religion, social structure, political philosophy, economic philosophy, education, and language. And bring to your attention the Hofstede Dimensions of National Culture. You might want to Google the Hofstede site, Hofstede Dimensions of National Culture. He was a consultant to IBM also, and he developed many years ago a survey of over 100,000 people in many different countries, and he was able to establish ratings of the attitudes culturally about power, about individualism versus collectivism, about uncertainty avoidance, masculinity versus femininity, long-term orientation versus short-term orientation, and indulgence versus restraint. So for that same company that I did the risk opportunity analysis for, I took the Hofstede ratings on culture and I said, here's where you currently do business. The size of the circle represents the amount of business that they were already doing in that country, their sales. And on the vertical axis is the degree of individualism and power distance. Power distance is the acceptance of authority. The higher the score, the more people just do what they're told. And individualism, of course, is an interesting thing to compare against that. It's the degree to which people think as individuals rather than as groups. And again, what I was trying to convey to them, because they wanted me to conduct a seminar for them on having a global mindset for their senior executives, and I was trying to introduce them to the different cultures. The last subject, so that we can close this and get it into your very important questions to us, is how you can mitigate some of these country risks and mitigate some of these cultural factors through alliances. Alliances can influence the impact of the country environment. And in particular, and we have evidence to support this, that the probability of the profits that you're going to achieve, as you know, nobody knows for sure how well you're going to do. There's a statistical curve, right? You'd like to be up here making these profits, but there's some chance that it's not going to work out. That goes to the left. Some chance that you might even, do more. When you make an alliance with another country, with a company in another country that you want to do business in, you can move that curve to the right. That is, you can increase the overall profitability through the knowledge and learning curve of the local company that you're either acquiring or joint venturing with or aligning with in some form. And also narrow the bandwidth of that statistical distribution so that you can believe that you're actually going to make that degree of profitability. And again, we have ample evidence to support this chart. And the last chart of the presentation is to say that, there are a lot of different ways you can think about the world. We talked about worldwide product divisions, we talked about international departments, but even in terms of just how you think of the world, do you think of it in terms of an overall global strategy? Do you think about it as a transnational strategy, as a multi-domestic strategy, as simply replicating what you do at home and doing the same thing overseas? And which you choose is very much determined by the pressures to reduce costs, but also the pressure for local adaptation. Again, not enough time today to get into the fact collection and systematic analysis and comparison analysis to be able to support this, but know that I do all of that as well. So that concludes the formal presentation part of this webinar. Again, you can note down my contact email, my telephone number in the United States. I look forward to the opportunity to do more with the Madinah Institute for Leadership and Entrepreneurship to drill down and present some more complete seminars on this subject and others, but I also am open to doing that with individual companies that come into contact with me. So let me go out of that and turn it back to
Yep. All right. Thank you.
Our great coordinator for this webinar.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Dr. Charles Newman, for a very, very intriguing presentation. Folks, we are now open for question and answers. So if you have any questions, you could either insert it in the question box or you could equally raise your hand. There's a hand icon available on the webinar console, so please click on it if you would like to have an audio conversation with Dr. Charles. So let me go. There are a couple of questions in the box. So in the first one, Dr. Charles, could you give us some real-world examples of how the country risk versus opportunity assessment was used by multinational corporations to improve their global strategy and profitability?
Well, that's an excellent question. I could give many examples, but let me give one that actually involves, surprisingly enough, Saudi Arabia. In the 1980s, the financial environment was going through what people were calling the less developed country debt crisis. The banking community, the commercial banking community had, starting in the 1970s and into the early early 1980s, lent hundreds of billions of dollars to developing countries to help promote their development and to do so profitably, charging, interest rates that were higher than the interest rates that they would charge domestically because of the increased risks. But it got to a point that the amount of debt that these countries had undertaken was greater than they could service. Debt servicing means the money that you have to pay quarterly or yearly on your loan. And so all of a sudden, many, in fact, most of the less developed countries, particularly in Latin America, but also in some other places, started to not repay those loans. And it became a major, major financial crisis. And it was greatly negatively impacting the earnings of the big banks because the accountants were saying, hey, if the country's not paying you back, you basically have to write that loan down to zero. That's no longer an asset, which would greatly negatively impact the earnings of the banks. So what developed was an active secondary market for that debt. In other words, banks would say, listen, we are owed $100 million by Mexico, but Mexico's not paying. Can we sell that to some other bank that isn't as negative about Mexico as we are? And so there was a lot of trading of that LDC debt in those days. Okay, I'm going to be a little bit quicker about this. So what happened is I was on one of my fact-finding missions that I used to do for Chase, and I was in the country of Chile, and I went to lunch with a second vice president of our bank there who showed me an article in the local newspaper about the fact that a Saudi financial institution had done a deal with the Chilean government. The Saudi financial institution wanted to start an auto finance company in the country of Chile, but they didn't want to make a new foreign direct investment into Chile because of the country risk. So the deal that they did is they said, look, you already owe us, I forget what the amount was, let's say it was $10 million. We'll write that off. You no longer owe that 10 million, but give us $10 million worth of Chilean pesos as the initial capitalization amount required for our auto finance company in your country. And the Chilean government agreed to that. Now, that was a small news story on the back page of the business section of the local newspaper. But I thought about it, and I said, that could be replicated. It turns out that is something that became known as debt for equity swaps within the developing countries. And from simply finding that fact, analyzing it, and realizing that there was a risk assessment disparity between the risks the banks had with not getting repaid and the risks that companies had from establishing businesses, factories, hotels, whatever it might be, in countries, that those weren't the same risk assessments. One of the things we learned about country risk assessment is it has to be drilled down and focused to the type of business that you're in. Well, that disparity made it reasonable to say Bank X that has $100 million worth of Mexican debt that is selling on the secondary market for 40 cents on the dollar, that you can go to General Motors Corporation, the automobile company, go to the chief financial officer and sell them that Mexican debt. They pay $40 million for it. Now they've got a piece of paper saying the Mexicans owe them $100 million. But of course, they're not going to get repaid, right? Why would they do that? Because now you take them down to Mexico City and meet with the finance minister of Mexico, and you say, we will write off that $100 million worth of debt if you give us $100 million worth of Mexican pesos to build an automobile assembly plant in northern Mexico. And the Mexican government agreed to that. Well, it turns out that this risk analysis disparity, so doing systematic country risk analysis, seeing the difference between the bank risk versus the manufacturing company risk, led to over $100 billion of debt for equity swaps and helped to greatly alleviate the LDC debt crisis. So I took more time than I should have, but that was one of my biggest bonus years, by the way, when I worked for Chase, because I really helped create that business for Chase. And think about how big and profitably that was as a whole new financial engineering product area for our investment bank to be operated in. So thank you for the question.
Thank you very much. And we have a question from Mr. Abdul Kabir Jimo. The question is, sir, how can the risks mentioned be mitigated to the barest minimum?
Well, you've made it difficult by saying to the barest minimum, but they can be mitigated. Once the world, meaning the world of business and the world of governments, became aware that there was this thing called country risk, and yet they didn't want that to be a reason for constraining international business activity. One of the countries that was just in the early stages of receiving a lot of direct investment was Singapore. And Singapore established a fund in Switzerland that said, if we do something bad that hurts your investment in our country, like takes away the asset or makes it impossible for you to earn money, we will have an insurance fund based in Switzerland that you will be able to draw from to compensate yourself for the risks that we put you to. And that greatly accelerated the amount of foreign direct investment into Singapore. So they were the first to do that. But later, some of the big insurance companies developed insurance products against country risk. Some governments, the Export-Import Bank of the United States, for example, developed products to mitigate some of the country risks. So there are, just as, and I know most of you are very international, you know about foreign exchange, you know about foreign exchange options as a way of mitigating foreign currency fluctuation risk. There are similar insurance instruments to mitigate at least some of the types of country risks that we're talking about. But the other thing, again, I remind you, is this forming of alliances with local companies who are well connected is perhaps an equally powerful way to mitigate the risk. But thank you for the question.
And we have a supplementary from Brother Jimo also, that can you please compare and contrast the effects of using interest-free banking and finance on profitability of a business with that of interest charging banking and finance?
Well, you know, I don't know if I'm fully qualified to answer that, to be honest with you. I am aware of the idea of Islamic banking, and I'm aware that there are a lot of very successful Islamic banks that are able to engage in profitable banking activities without the charging of interest. I've only begun, frankly, in recent years to begin to look at that. So I do not want to come across as an expert on it, but it can be done. And, you know, there are a lot of ways, in America, we have a saying, there are a lot of ways to skin a cat. And so, you know, Islamic banking is not there to lose money, but it does, you know, through fees and other types of things, able to conduct its business without necessarily explicitly charging interest on loans, which, as I understand it in that culture, is prohibited. So you're probably much more expert than I am about it. I think it's an intriguing and important concept. As the Islamic world once again becomes much more important as a global player, I think the rest of us are going to have to learn more about this. But again, I don't want to come across as an expert on it.
Well, thank you very much. And we have one last question. Can you give us an example of how cultural differences negatively impacted a real multinational company's global strategy?
Okay. Early in my career, before I was involved in international things, I worked for AT&T, American Telephone and Telegraph, which at the time was the world's largest company. We had over 1,200,000 employees, but we only did business in the United States. It was part of our regulated monopoly agreement with the US government. And one of the reasons I left them to go join Chase Manhattan is I wanted to be involved in international business. But shortly after I left, Chase AT&T was forced to split up into many different companies and no longer have monopoly status. But one thing that allowed them to do, the monopoly status prohibited them from doing business outside the United States. And so now, without not being a monopoly anymore, they were allowed to, but they had never done it before. And they were anxious to make a major play as an international telecommunications company. And I was one of many consultants that they called in to look at the opportunities. What they ended up doing is they did a joint venture with Telecom Italia, the largest telecommunications company in Italy that had a global presence already. And they said, well, we're just going to do a joint venture with them. They're already a global player. Therefore, right from the very beginning, we're going to be a global player. I warned them against this, and I did it on the basis of my assessment of the Italian business culture versus the American business culture in general, but specifically the AT&T business culture, which was more the Midwestern part of the United States. Very conservative, non-risk-taking, very rule-bound, okay, kind of boring, right? Versus the more entrepreneurial but flamboyant and rule-breaking business culture in Italy. And I said, this is never going to work. 5 years later, after investing billions of dollars, they had to break up and part ways. It just didn't work culturally between those two countries, the companies, Telecom Italia and AT&T, United States, and Italy. So that's one of the more dramatic examples of where culture came into play.
Well, thank you very much, and that really brings us towards the end of the webinar. Dr. Charles, any quick concluding remarks that you would like to give before we dismiss out?
Well, again, I've shared a framework trying to get you to think structurally, gathering the right facts systematically and comparatively. I cannot pretend that in 40 minutes I've been able to go enough into the detail on any of this, but believe me, that's what I do. Sometimes I do it in an academic setting, sometimes I do it in a consulting setting, sometimes a combination of the two. But there's a lot more where this comes from. This just gave you the overview. So hopefully my friends at Mael and I are going to find some ways that we might be able to offer more substantive help to you as you go global in a great way and profitably.